All right, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. As you can see by the view, I now have my interviewee right beside me as well, so you can see both of us at the same time. So now I won't be goofing around and stretching and everything while I'm asking questions and the other person's answering them, which is great. So today I have a very special guest with me. He is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology. His name is Dr. Kobsar, and he has been working at McMaster for a year now. He just finished up his graduate studies, and that's going to be one of the main focuses of our video today is pursuing graduate studies. And what we mean by that is a master's, a PhD, and a lot of the things in academia and research. So first and foremost, Dr. Kobsar, or Dylan, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for doing this interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be involved in this. I think it's a great resource for students and undergrads. So I'm happy to help out with it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. So we'll get into the first question. If you want, you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your educational history and things like that as well. You obviously studied in a variety of provinces, and now you're at Mac as a professor in the Department of Kinesiology. So yeah, feel free to just tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so I am a professor here in the Department of Kinesiology, as you said. My research is focused primarily in human movement, so looking at trying to analyze the human body. Specifically, a lot of my research uses wearable technology, so looking to use wearable sensors that we can put on people and have them go through a series of movements, or maybe go through in their sporting activity or through rehab, and try to analyze that movement and come up with some actionable insights to either improve how they're doing something or track the trajectory of a disease. And so I started my academic career, I guess, in Saskatchewan, where I grew up. I did an undergrad in Saskatchewan at the University of Regina in kinesiology, and then I followed that up with a master's there. And then from there, I moved to the University of Calgary with my wife, and I did a PhD there in biomechanics for about 4.5 years. And then following that, I did what's called a postdoc, postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Medicine for a year before I came all the way back to the other side of the country to Hamilton here at McMaster.
Yeah, that sounds like a journey. What's it like going from province to province to province? Is it something you enjoyed? Is there a lot of differences you saw in the overall education and just living conditions overall?
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky because I think we started in Saskatchewan and moved to Alberta before moving to BC. So it was a slow change, I guess. Saskatchewan is a very different place from Vancouver, and so taking the step to Calgary was helpful. We really enjoyed Calgary, and I think in terms of the different educational experiences, there's obviously a lot of different experiences at different universities. It really comes down to the focus of the program a lot of times. So all very good universities, but sometimes different programs have different focuses. And so that's a big part of it.
Cool. If you like had to go back and do it all again, would you pick just the one university and stick with that, or would you still like to go from place to place to place?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So generally, it's a difficult decision to move universities, right? Like to someplace you're comfortable with. People build up a big social network where they are, and it's tough to uproot and go elsewhere. But it can be a really good experience to just broaden not only your professional network, but also the experiences that you get at these universities. And so going back, I think I was lucky in that I was able to begin my grad school at the same university that I did my undergrad at. So I was able to do my undergrad and my master's at the same university, which was quite beneficial, I think. But then after that, I moved on to a different university to complete more extensive graduate training through a PhD, which I think is very important. Although there's varying opinions on that, and there's no one size fits all for sure. Sometimes staying in one place can be perfect, but I think anytime you can broaden your experiences, it's good to do so. And also, a lot of times the easiest route isn't always the best route. It definitely would have been the easiest route to stay at one university, but it definitely wouldn't have been the best route for me anyways.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the sort of big questions I wanted to ask was regarding actual graduate studies and the training itself. So there's a lot of undergrads, they consider doing a master's, they consider doing a PhD, but not everyone knows a whole lot about it and what it entails. Can you tell us a little bit about what your experience was like in your graduate studies, going from your undergrad and then to your master's, your PhD, and then your postdoc, and sort of the differences and similarities in that entire time?
For sure. So I think university in general, one of the things that people realize is that it is quite independent. So if you're coming from high school and moving on to university, you realize, it's much more independent. I don't have to be at class. You have to be self-motivated. And that becomes even a bigger part of grad school, is that it is very internally driven. You need to be self-motivated, and it a lot of times is quite independent. But that's, I think, some of the things that I loved about it, because you're for the most part, you're going to be driving the work that you do, whether it's the research project or the courses that you're picking, or the courses that you're choosing. You're driving all of that, and I think that's one of the big advantages of it. So um, from the master's side of things, again, it's a very unique experience and very individualized, because you're directly focused in what your specific research area is.
Hmm. For sure. So there's a lot of undergrads right now. A lot of like, especially like pre-medical students, they want to go to like either med school, or even like people who want to go into dental school, pharmacy school, all these various professional schools. And a lot of them actually consider doing a master's as sort of like a quote unquote backup plan.
Mhm.
So do you have any sort of thoughts on that, in terms of giving advice for those people? Like what should they sort of expect with sort of applying to one school as their primary choice and then sort of falling back on a master's if things don't work out? Do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's going to happen, right? It's in general, I always tell people, if you're taking on graduate school, you should be obviously very interested in the topic, because, as I said, it is very independent, and so you're going to need to be extremely self motivated. So you need to be excited about the topic. That doesn't necessarily mean that if it's a backup plan, you're not excited about it as well, right? So I think it's a matter of choosing a program, or choosing a supervisor and a research program that, even if it is your backup, it's something that you're very excited about, and it's something that you're very interested in. And a master's degree can be a good stepping stone to kind of identify if it is something that you want to go down deeper into this research, or this area of academia, whatever it may be, without getting into the PhD side of things. So, not to kind of step too far ahead, but I think um, I'm much more okay with, I guess, the idea of having a backup into a master's degree than a backup into a PhD, because a PhD is something that you shouldn't take lightly, and having that as a backup plan, I think, is very different than a master's.
Yeah, for sure. What would you say is like the main difference between PhD and master's overall, in terms of your training and what you're doing overall?
Yeah, so I think in the masters, you're kind of just scratching the surface of what research is, and getting a taste for it. Although you're doing it for usually 2 years, 2 years goes by pretty quick, and you realize that there's a lot of stuff in this area that you may not know much about. There's a lot of areas that you thought you were interested in, that maybe you're interested in another area. And so really, that 2 years is really just giving you some broad experience into research. You're taking on generally one research project in that 2 years. You're getting some specific courses related to that. But again, it's a pretty tight research project, and you need to stay focused for that 2 years. When you're into the PhD, you're looking at building multiple research studies, or um, multiple research studies that build into the same thesis project. And so you're doing a much, much more extensive background, a lot more training. You're a lot more in depth into these studies that you're doing, and you're putting it all together into this big thesis. You're also doing some composite exams. So you're doing these uh, a full spectrum of um, research activities. So it's a much bigger undertaking, and a PhD is generally 4 years, or maybe a little more.
Mm. Yeah, it's a long process for sure. What about
Mhm.
the transition from a PhD to your postdoc? So the postdoc's usually only a year or two, I believe, right?
Yeah, so it varies quite a bit. Generally, once you graduate from a PhD program, you may look to get a job either in industry or in academia as a professor. But a lot of times now, postdoctoral studies are kind of a stepping stone to a professor position. And so it gives you the ability to do more independent research, although you are still under a supervisor as a postdoc. Uh, you're no longer a student; you have a PhD, and so you're able to do research that you can kind of focus a bit more on only the research itself, build your publication background, build some more technical skills, um, and all doing that well if you're looking for a professor job, trying to position yourself correctly for the job that you want. And so it is a big transition to go from all these, but they're kind of one step at a time, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned publications as well, which sort of brings another idea to mind. So a lot of undergrad students, they want to get their head into research. They want to get their foot in the door just to like sort of get a feel for how things are. And hopefully, like at the end of the day, they sort of want to get a publication out of it as well, because I guess it's good to get recognized for your work. What advice would you give to undergrads who are looking to sort of get involved in research early and work with their professors and try to like get one or two studies done during their undergrad?
Yeah, I mean, having publications is a huge part of research and academia. So anytime you can get experience on those things or on a research project that leads to a publication, it's great. It's definitely difficult to when you're first starting out as an undergrad to come in with the definite idea or the purpose to get a publication out of something, because that may not always be the case. And so I would say it's just important to help out in as many ways as you can and be open to as many experiences as you can, and try to learn as much as you can. At the end of the day, hopefully you're able to get a publication from that. But if nothing else, you should be able to gain a lot of really important skills and experience from that. And again, if you're able to get a publication out of that, it's going to be great going forward, because publications are essentially the currency in academia.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of doing projects, so there's a lot of students they want to do this. Some students really want to get involved in lab research. Others just want to do like let's say a systematic review, which is a much shorter project overall. What advice would you give to students? Let's say they're trying to do one or two projects during their undergrad, but sometimes the project will take like a lot much longer than some other projects would take. So what advice would you give to students who are sort of trying to get that publication in, also trying to get research experience in, but they sort of can't balance both sides of the.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I think what students will often realize is that the publication process takes a lot longer than you expect it does, whether that is from writing the publication or working on the study yourself or within the lab, or whether it's the actual publication process of getting it
Yeah.
submitted and out. It's going to take a long time.
Mm.
And so knowing that going in is going to be important, that you can't expect to simply join a lab for a couple months and get some experience and have this publication out within 6 months. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
There may be some times where that happens, but in general, I think you need to kind of set your expectations a little lower maybe, but again, always try to help out and try to have as much of impact as you can, focusing on the learning aspect, I guess, so that you're always taking something out of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And you mentioned like research being a very long process for sure. So for me, like my own personal experience, I've seen like I've sent out a paper and then got rejected, and then all the reviewers' comments came back, and then we had to work it and fix it on those. Then we send it back, and then it still doesn't work out. So there's a whole bunch of things you have to do, and I think research in and of itself is a very long study process. Can be very meticulous at times. So what are your sort of like, I would say ups and downs with the research process? What do you find to be the things you enjoy the most, and then the things that you find to be a little bit more difficult?
Yeah, I think the things that I enjoy the most is the things that a lot of people enjoy the most, which is kind of running a project from start to finish. And the best part is kind of that point at which you initially had the concept of the study, generated the research question, and then you get to the point where you actually have all the results, and you can kind of now finally answer that question and see, we put all this work in, and we've done all this awesome research, and now we get to see the answer essentially. And that's always the most exciting part for me, is kind of revealing what the findings are. And it generally, it's usually not a world-changing finding that changes the whole landscape of your research field. It's generally a small finding that then generates more questions. So that's the second part of it, is not only finding that the answer or the potential answer to the question, but generating more questions. And there's always more questions that get generated, and that's the really exciting and interesting point for sure. The difficult part with it, I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into that, and research can be a tedious thing, and sometimes that can be a little bit draining, especially when you're the graduate student and you have to collect 80 people for your study, and you're looking ahead, seeing like you need to do all this work, collect all these people to get to that point. And there's always, the path is never as direct as you think it is. So it can be a lot of work along the way, but at the end, it's the work that you put in that makes that final piece the most rewarding part of it all.
Yeah, for sure. Or even if you're doing like a systematic review and you got to go through like 1,000 studies just to come up with 10 that go in your final paper, take a long time. So that's my sort of experience.
Sure.
So how did it go for you when you were going from PhD to postdoc, and now you just spent a year McMaster in the Department of Kinesiology? What was that overall transition like? And well, what does a sort of typical day in your life look like now as a professor at our university?
Yeah. So the biggest change, or the biggest transition to get accustomed with, is moving from a postdoc or postdoctoral fellow. Your entire focus is on research. So the research project that you're doing, or the research projects that you're doing, you may be mentoring some students here and there, but you're quite focused on specifically your research and trying to get out publications. When you start a professor job, you are still doing that aspect of it, but you're also doing a number of other things. So that is prepping for teaching. So either developing a course, or walking in and maybe teaching a course that's already developed. You're collaborating with other people in the department, or in the faculty, or at the university level, or internationally. And then there's a lot of service things that you're doing at the university as well. And so it becomes, the biggest transition, I guess, is trying to wear all those hats simultaneously, and getting accustomed to that. Because as a professor, you go through grad school and you do a ton of work on research and how to do good research, and you're supposed to be an expert in your area. But then when you become a professor, you not only need to be an expert in your area, but you need to do all of these other things, which is teaching, doing other service activities, and collaborating, doing industry projects. And so there's a lot of other things that come into play, and that's kind of the biggest part, that and managing the time between all those.
Yeah, for sure. And in the last video, Dr. Howard talked to us a lot about being a teaching stream professor, and how most of her time is taken up with prepping for courses, speaking with students, a lot of that sort of stuff. So you're sort of on the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, you did just start, but you are probably more of a research professor right now. Can you sort of highlight the differences and what that's like between being a teaching professor versus a research professor, and how sort of your typical day would look like compared to someone else who's more involved in teaching?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So yeah, I am primarily, focused in the research side of things. It varies depending on the position that you get, what level of research to teaching it is. Generally, they say it's 40% research, 40% teaching, 20% service. But that can vary depending on the position and depending on where you're hired. And so really, teaching is supposed to be 40% of my job. So the equally large portion of my job, or if not more, is the research side of it. And so that means that although I'll be teaching less classes, I'll be doing a lot of other things that are focused in research and other collaborations at the university. So in terms of a typical day, I think that's one of the biggest advantages and the things that I love the most about this job is that there isn't really a typical day. It changes a lot. So if I'm in the middle of teaching a course, I'm going to be doing a lot more work, prepping for lectures, giving lectures, meeting with students, still doing research and still doing other things. But those days will be a little different than they would perhaps leading up to the fall, where we're trying to write a bunch of research grants usually. So when you get towards grant season, I'll maybe be spending a little bit less time teaching or prepping for teaching and a lot more time writing research grants. There's obviously writing papers and working with students and mentoring students in research and teaching. So the typical day is kind of anything but typical, I guess, in that you're answering emails, you're writing papers, you're writing research grants, you're doing teaching or teaching activities, and a bunch of other things, collaborating with people across university, in industry. But the amount of all that varies from day to day for sure.
Yeah, and I think with most jobs, I think with anyone at McMaster being a professor in any department, I think most people, even if they have a similar position, their overall day would still look very different. So getting to where you are now and looking back at your whole journey from, from the BSc to the master's to the PhD to the postdoc, if you look back at everything now, which part did you find to be the most rewarding, or the part which you most enjoyed, and which part was the most difficult in that journey?
So I would say my PhD was probably the most rewarding, because as I kind of said at the start, doing the master's degree, you just start to kind of scratch the surface of what research is. And so I think for me, my master's degree, it really piqued my interest in research. I got a lot of great experience and I did a lot of awesome things there. But doing the PhD, you're able to take that time to dive in to the research, and really find your passion for the project, and learn a bunch of different skills. And again, it is very independently driven. So in my PhD, I was doing anything from engineering and developing wearable sensors that we would be using in our projects, all the way to helping or running some exercise interventions for people with osteoarthritis. And so I was able to do all of these different things throughout my training, and I found that extremely rewarding. I think the toughest thing for me was the sort of need to, or the transition from different place. Again, I'm in a little bit of maybe a different situation than some graduate students. Maybe I actually had my wife and I had 2 kids during my PhD. So again, it was a great experience going through the PhD, and it was great to be able to start our family and start our life during my PhD. But the most difficult thing is then moving around after that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's generally the case for graduate students. If you're looking to find a job as a professor, a lot of times you're going to have to be flexible to stay at the same university where you did your undergrad, do all of your graduate training, and then get a job at that university as a professor. If that's your goal, it's very difficult to do for a number of reasons. Not just whatever training you're getting is its own kind of animal, but more so just you never know where things are going to go and what positions are going to open up, and your specific area of research, once you've completed all that graduate training, is going to qualify you for a specific subset of jobs. And for all you know, that job may not open up at that university. So being flexible and being able to understand that you're going to have to move around a little bit until you find sort of your permanent job.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in general, with any long career path, it does become difficult when you have to move constantly, and it can be very draining to have to do that. So
Yeah.
having had that experience, you mentioned in your PhD, you and your wife, you had 2 kids. I think there's a lot of people out there right now as well, who want to go down this career path and they know it's very long, whether it be academia, research, or even something like medicine or some other professional school, which takes several years of training to do. Based on your experience, what advice would you want to give to someone who is, they're ready to start a family, they're ready to sort of get their personal life out and going, they want to start that aspect of their life, but at the same time, they want to do their training for their job. So what advice can you give on that based on your experience?
No, I think it's an important point because you know, in looking back, I think I was in school for like 13 years or something to that number when you start from undergrad all the way to my postdoc, to the end of my postdoc. And to put your life on hold for that long is difficult. And for some people it works really well, for others it doesn't, right? Everyone has their own goal of what they're trying, what they want to do in their career and what they want to do in their life. And so my advice would be that there is good opportunities to be funded through your graduate school and graduate training, and that does give you the opportunity to be a bit more flexible and have some of these opportunities as well. You're not necessarily living as an undergrad your whole graduate training, or you don't have to anyways. If you do really good work and you have you know, publications, you have great grades going into this, and you're doing great research, there's a lot of awesome funding opportunities that can allow you to essentially, I always looked at it as my graduate school is my job. And so I had graduated from my undergraduate degree, and now I'm just starting the next area of training. But in this case, I viewed it more as a job, and I'm not simply in school anymore, so I can kind of it's not as easy as some other jobs to just start your life. But at the same time, you can do it if you work hard enough at it and you put your mind to it.
Yeah, for sure. You can usually do anything you put your mind to, but yeah, it's great to get your side of the story on that. So sort of the last question, this is kind of the big picture question I like to ask everyone at the end. What advice would you want to give to someone who is trying to pursue a career path that is very similar to yours? And what advice would you give even to your past self, like when you were pursuing this career path? So sort of like, it's sort of the same thing in terms of giving advice, but what's sort of the one thing you'd want to tell people that this is what you got to know if you want to do this?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is again finding something that you're really passionate about, because it's a long road and it's a lot of work, and it isn't always a lot of payoff along the road, if that makes sense. So you're putting in a lot of hours along the way. You may or may not get good financial payoff throughout. Hopefully at the end you do, but it's going to be a lot of work, and you'll need to really focus on the path that you want to take. And what I mean by that is, when I started, my focus was in biomechanics and human movement, and I realized relatively early on that I wanted to get into wearable sensor research, because all the stuff that we were doing in the lab had great applications to athletes, to older adults, to all these areas, but it was really hard to get that information to them, and wearable sensors offered the ability to do that. And so I identified really early on that this is an area that I wanted to focus on, and this is a path that I wanted to take. And so I tried to position myself in such a way that that I got the expertise that I needed to in those areas. And so that meant, you know, going to Calgary to do my PhD, going to the University of British Columbia to get some additional clinical experience. And so trying to identify that path along the way, and having a long-term goal. I always wanted to get to this position at the end. And so what that means is, if you know that you want to be in academia, you need to focus on getting publications and hopefully getting some teaching experience in some manner, because that's going to be most of your job, is doing research, publishing papers, and teaching. If you're looking to go into this grad school and maybe get into industry after that, then maybe you have a different path. So I think, although it can be difficult early on, trying to identify that path as early on as possible, and it's going to flex, it's going to change and manipulate along the way, but at least having a goal of where you're going and working towards that goal from a career perspective is going to be very important. I guess the other side of it is the advice I would give myself if I could do it again. I think one of the biggest things in my research in the biomechanical space is having, and the way that a lot of this research is going now, whether it's in academia or in industry, we have the ability to collect a huge amount of data very, I don't say easily, but relatively easily compared to what it would have been years ago, right? We can put a sensor on someone, we can collect all this information. And so it's really common in wearable sensors, but it's common in a lot of areas that we have all this data now. And I was lucky that I was able to kind of pick up some of these skills throughout my graduate training, primarily in my PhD. But I think having a stronger background with that in terms of the data management, coding, programming, that type of thing early on would have been very helpful for me. Again, that's specific to my research area, but it's something that I do recommend to a lot of undergrad students if they're interested in getting into some area of research that is somewhat data centric. If you can get involved in programming and coding early on, it's going to make your life easier going forward. And those skills translate to a lot of different areas. So it's never a bad thing to get involved in some training in data science, Python, MATLAB, whatever it may be.
Yeah, for sure. Those are definitely valuable skills to have. And I think that's great advice as well. So that's pretty much going to end up the interview there. I hope everyone found it helpful. Once again, thank you so much, Dylan, for doing this. I'm sure that your wise words are going to help out a lot of people. Do you have any last words before we sort of head out?
No, it's great to chat with you. It's especially during the COVID pandemic right now. It's great to have some social interaction, even though it's virtual. So hopefully this is going to be helpful for people. And if anyone has any specific questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me. It's one of the things that I always say is, I think people are generally, especially at universities, but even in industry settings, people are generally quite happy to help out in any way they can. So if you send out emails to people, it may seem a bit daunting early on to send out a cold email to someone. But generally people are quite good at getting back to you. I know in the last year, it's been a lot more difficult for me just because of all the other things that you're doing. And so if I could give any advice to that side of things, just to kind of wrap this up, is if you are sending out emails or trying to contact people that you'd be interested in doing research with, that you'd be interested in collaborating with, just try to show interest and show that you've done your background a bit when you're contacting them, so that you're not looking like it's a generic email that's sent out to everybody, but you're actually interested in it. And again, I think for the most part, people are really happy to do that. So try not to be afraid to do that kind of stuff. And if someone doesn't get back to you right away, it's usually not because they don't want to. It's sometimes because they're busy and there's a lot of emails that are coming in, especially in this season. So stick with it. And people, especially at McMaster and other Canadian universities all around the world, they're always happy to help out as much as they can, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And at the end of the day, the worst thing that can happen is they say no, and that's not the end of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dylan. That does end the interview. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next episode.